The last letter Robert Eugene Otto ever wrote was found hidden completely out of sight. It was slipped precisely beneath a loosening floorboard in the claustrophobic confines of the turret room high at the top of the somber house on Eaton Street in Key West, Florida. It was dated the 14th of November, 1974, yet the handwriting belonged to a man desperately fighting against time. The script was erratic, terrifyingly frantic. The black ink had been pressed so violently into the heavy paper that the fountain pen's nib had torn clean through the parchment in certain places. The letter was addressed to no one, intended for anyone who might find it, perhaps as a final plea to the universe. It read in its harrowing entirety, "He is still watching, he has always been watching. I made a terrible mistake when I was 4 years old, and I have been paying for it every single day of my long agonizing life since. Do not let him out of the turret. Do not, under any circumstances, let him out." Exactly 3 weeks after the ink dried on that desperate, ragged letter, Robert Eugene Otto was found dead in that exact same turret room. The official coroner's report listed the cause of death as heart failure. He was 72 years old, his body ravaged as much by unseen stress as by age. But those who found his body noted a chilling detail never recorded in the police files. The doll was sitting in the wooden rocking chair across from the bed. Its rigid, handmade body was perfectly still, but its glassy black eyes were no longer looking vaguely into the room. They were unnervingly focused, staring directly at the heavy wooden door, waiting for whoever would enter next. Welcome back to the archives. Tonight, we blow the dust off a file that has disturbed investigators and skeptics alike for over a century. Tonight, we open the file on Robert, not the man who lived a tormented life, but the thing that stole his name. The thing that arrived in the suffocating heat of 1904 and more than 100 years later has not yet left. The island of Key West in 1904 was a strange, isolated place, permanently caught between two worlds. It sat at the very southern tip of the Florida Keys, culturally and physically closer to the vibrant chaos of Havana than to the burgeoning modernities of Miami. It was a place where the Atlantic Ocean and the Gulf of Mexico pressed against one another in an uneasy, restless coexistence. The Florida sun beat down mercilessly, and the air pressing against the tall, narrow houses was a physical weight, thick with sea salt, the oppressive humidity of an approaching hurricane, and the pungent, unmistakable smell of fish drying on wooden racks near the rotting docks. The streets were narrow corridors of shade, lined with stately Victorian homes built by wealthy ship captains who deeply understood the terrifying geometry of violent storms, yet knew nothing of the quiet, creeping terrors that could take root inside their walls. The Otto family lived in one of these imposing structures at 1040 Eaton Street. Thomas Otto was an affluent physician, well regarded in the community, a man of science who demanded absolute logic and order in a loud, chaotic world. His wife, Anne, managed the sprawling house with the quiet, chilling authority of a woman who understood that managing the world silently was far more effective than raising her voice. They were exceedingly wealthy by the humble standards of the island. Following the rigid social customs of their time and class, they maintained a full staff of domestic servants to uphold their pristine reputation. Among these unseen workers was a young woman whose full name has deliberately been erased from history. No census, no diary, no ledger contains it. She is referred to in the few surviving documents only as the Bahamian girl, or in one particularly gossipy neighbor's letter, as the mysterious woman from the islands who worked the Otto kitchen. What is definitively known is that she came from the Bahamas, carrying with her the deep, ancient traditions of her homeland, that she had dutifully worked for the Otto family for several years, and that by the sultry, oppressive autumn of 1904 she and Thomas Otto had a catastrophic conflict. The exact nature of the dispute is shrouded in rumors. Some sanitized accounts suggest a mundane disagreement over withheld wages. Other, darker, whispered imply a severe physical punishment, or worse, inflicted by Thomas Otto, deeply offending the woman's dignity and causing profound, unforgivable humiliation. What every single account agrees upon is that the relationship had violently deteriorated beyond any hope of repair. She was summarily dismissed, thrown out without a character reference in a town where reputation was survival. But before she vanished into the humid Key West night, never to be heard from again, she gave one final parting gift to the Otto's beloved youngest child. The boy's name was Robert Eugene Otto. He was barely 4 years old, a frail child with dark, overly serious eyes. He possessed a silent, observant nature, not an unhappy child exactly, but unnervingly watchful. His family affectionately called him Gene. The gift was a doll. It stood approximately 110 centimeters tall, near the exact height of the toddler himself. It was a crude, uncanny thing, clearly handmade. Its internal skeleton was a harsh wire frame, roughly wrapped in coarse linen cloth, and stuffed tight with fragrant straw and coarse wood shavings that crunched slightly when squeezed. The face was the masterstroke of horror, constructed from hardened painted bisque. It lacked the rosy cheeks and smiling dimples of contemporary toys. Instead, it wore a fixed, ambiguous expression, neither smiling nor frowning, not malicious yet certainly not kind. It hovered permanently in the deeply unsettling, uncertain territory of the uncanny valley. It was dressed meticulously in a miniature, white sailor suit, complete with a small, hand-embroidered insignia on the chest that matched the boy's own clothing. Tucked under the doll's arm was a small, crudely stuffed lion, also made of cloth, also staring blankly with cold glass eyes. But it was the eyes of the doll itself that drew the most attention. They were made of two large jet-black glass buttons set unnaturally deep into the pale bisque face. They caught the harsh Florida sunlight in a way that defied the laws of optics. They did not simply reflect light, they seemed to actively absorb it, pulling the illumination from the room, holding it in an impenetrable black void, and releasing it only when they chose to, as though a conscious, calculating intelligence behind the glass was studying the world, deciding precisely how much of itself to reveal. Gene immediately named the doll Robert, or rather, as he chillingly informed his confused mother later that evening, he insisted that the doll had spoken to him, stating that its own name was Robert, and that the boy's name would henceforth simply be Gene. His wealthy, rational parents found this imaginary role reversal deeply charming. At first, the first time Ann Otto heard the two voices, a sudden, inexplicable chill ran down her spine, defying the midday Florida heat. She was standing at the bottom of the grand wooden staircase, balancing a heavy woven basket of folded linen against her hip. It was early morning, the light filtering through the windows still gray and fragile, the specific hour when the island smelled most aggressively of dead coral and the open sea. Jean's bedroom door at the top of the landing was firmly closed. Yet from behind that thick mahogany door came the distinct sound of a conversation, two voices trading dialogue back and forth. One voice was undoubtedly Jean's, high-pitched, inquisitive, possessing the natural cadence of a child. She recognized it instantly. He was asking something she could not fully make out, a question followed by a respectful pause, then another question. But it was the second voice that froze her in place. It was significantly lower, rougher in texture, guttural. She would later desperately attempt to describe it in a letter to her sister as not a child's voice, and yet not quite a grown man's voice. It was something entirely else, something that existed in the wretched space between those two things. It sounded precisely like something that had intensely studied human speech for a long time without ever having actually lived inside a human body. Leaving the laundry basket on the stairs, her heart hammering against her ribs, Anne climbed the steps as quietly as she could and aggressively pushed the door open. Jean was sitting on the polished hardwood floor beside the large window, cross-legged, his small hands folded neatly in his lap with the solemn formality of someone engaged in an incredibly serious negotiation. The doll was propped against the opposite wall. Its black glass eyes were aimed directly, intensely at the boy. Gene casually looked up at his mother. His expression was not that of a child caught playing in secret. It was not startled or embarrassed. It was the profoundly disturbing expression of an adult interrupted in the middle of a private, high-stakes consultation, who is politely but firmly waiting for the interruption to leave. "Who were you talking to?" Anne asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Robert was telling me something important," Gene replied without missing a beat. "Robert cannot talk, Gene. Robert is just a doll." Gene considered his mother's profound ignorance for a moment, nodding with appropriate seriousness. Then he locked his dark eyes with hers and said, "He can talk, but he only talks when he wants to." Unsettled, Anne grabbed the doll by its stiff, straw-filled arm, marched out of the room, and locked it inside the dark hall closet at the end of the corridor. She pocketed the ornate brass key, but by the time she returned upstairs exactly 20 minutes later to check on her son, her blood turned to ice. The heavy closet door remained locked, yet the doll was back in Gene's room. It was propped against the exact same wall, facing the exact same direction, staring at the boy. Gene was downstairs in the dining room, eating his breakfast. He had not, as far as Anne could definitively prove, come back upstairs. She did not dare attempt to move the doll a third time. 3 distinct, deeply terrifying patterns of anomalous behavior slowly established themselves over the decade that followed, eroding the Otto family's grip on sanity. The first pattern was the bizarre room arrangement. Gene began to insist, with the absolute, uncompromising consistency of a fanatic, that Robert be given his own heavy wooden chair at the formal dining table. He demanded the doll be treated not as a favored toy, but as an equal family member entitled to a full-place setting, crystal glassware, and a formally folded linen napkin. By the year 1911, this deeply abnormal ritual had become so deeply woven into the fabric of the household that neither Thomas nor Anne found it remarkable enough to fight against. The normalization of the abnormal is perhaps the most chilling detail of all. Second pattern involved the horrific sounds that poisoned the night. Beginning in the humid summer of 1906, the closely packed neighbors on Eaton Street began reporting bizarre auditory anomalies emanating from the Otto residence during the deadest hours of the night. These were not the sounds of domestic violence or a child's night terrors. They were far harder to categorize. They described a low, guttural, rhythmic quality, not quite human humming, not quite animalistic breathing. There would be the sudden violent impact of heavy wooden furniture being dragged across the floorboards, and most consistently, the unmistakable rapid pitter-patter of tiny hard feet sprinting frantically across the upstairs hallways in rooms that were supposedly empty and locked. A prominent neighbor, a meticulous accountant named Harold Peabody, wrote in a frantic, ink-smudged entry in his diary on the 3rd of March, 1908, "I heard the frantic footsteps again from the upper floors of the Otto house last night. They commenced at approximately 1 in the morning and continued relentlessly for perhaps 40 unbroken minutes. They do not sound like a child playing. They move with vicious purpose. They rush across the floor. They stop dead. They return. I have decided, in cowardice, not to raise this matter with Dr. Otto, for I do not know how I could possibly phrase the concern without sounding as though my own mind has fractured into madness." The third, and arguably most destructive pattern, was what Gene calmly stated when chaos erupted within the house. Exquisite porcelain vases would be found shattered into powder against distant walls. Gene's other toys were frequently discovered completely mutilated, torn limb from limb, and rearranged in grotesque,
ritualistic patterns, as though by an unseen force that found the original anatomical arrangement offensive. Small, deliberate fires would be found smoldering in
the servant's kitchen in the middle of the night without any logical point of ignition. A beloved pet canary was found dead, its neck snapped cleanly, lying on the floor of its inexplicably open steel cage. Every single time a disaster was discovered, when Gene was rigorously questioned by his furious father, by the terrified housekeeper, or by visiting relatives, his response was a carbon copy of the last. He would look up at the towering adults with his dark, unnervingly watchful eyes. He would let a heavy silence develop, a pause of precisely the length required to communicate that he was carefully selecting his words so the adults could comprehend them. And then, in a monotone voice utterly devoid of guilt, distress, or empathy, he would state, "I didn't do it, Robert did it." By the autumn of 1914, the psychological atmosphere inside the house on Eaton Street had become violently toxic. Eugene Otto left Key West. He was 14 years old, and his sudden departure was an orchestrated, engineered exile masked beneath the polished language of upper-class opportunity and refined education. Thomas Otto, pale and exhausted, had spent a fortune arranging for his only son to attend a strict boarding school on the mainland, followed by art studies in New York and subsequently an extended stay in Paris. The true intention behind this elaborate geographical trajectory was implicitly understood by every servant, every neighbor, and every family friend who never dared speak it aloud. Gene was to be aggressively severed from the island. He was to be sent as far away from the house on Eaton Street as money could buy. He was to be separated from the thing that lived in his bedroom, the entity that whispered through the baseboards and moved relentlessly through the dark corridors at night. But the doll, conspicuously, was left strictly behind. An archival letter authored by Ann Otto, sent to a distant relative in Tampa and dated the rainy spring of 1915, contains a passage that speaks volumes of the family's secret terror. The ink is smudged, perhaps by tears, perhaps by trembling hands. The awful object remains securely in the house. Thomas severely wished to burn it or throw it into the deep gulf, but I vehemently counseled against this action. I am plagued by a persistent waking nightmare that attempting to destroy it would constitute a declaration of war, a profound provocation I am entirely unprepared to invite upon our home. It has been isolated in the high turret room. The solid oak door is deadbolted. I wear the only key on an iron chain around my neck, and yet I can still hear it pacing. The turret room was a claustrophobic circular space at the very peak of the Victorian house, accessible only by a dangerously steep, narrow staircase. It featured a single weather-beaten window that looked out over Eaton Street like an unblinking eye. From 1914 onward, it served as a solitary confinement cell for the unholy artifact. Ann Otto passed away in 1945, her final days plagued by dementia, in which she constantly screamed at unseen figures. Thomas had preceded her to the grave by 6 years, driven to an early end by heart complications. The imposing property naturally passed to Gene, who was by then a 45-year-old, moderately successful, though highly eccentric and deeply solitary painter. Driven by an invisible tether he could not explain, Gene returned to Key West in 1958. He returned to the suffocating silence of the house on Eaton Street. Within an hour of his arrival, ignoring the layers of dust covering his childhood home, he walked directly to the third floor. He produced the iron key, unlocked the heavy oak door himself, ascended the creaking narrow stairs alone, and sat in the stagnant air of the turret room for 3 unbroken hours. When he finally descended to the ground floor, his clothes were covered in decades of dust. Cradled gently in his adult arms as one might hold a frail, beloved child, was the doll. Without a word, he placed it reverently into a large wooden rocking chair, which he forcefully dragged downstairs and positioned prominently in the front parlor, directly by a large bay window that faced the bustling street outside. When his new bride, Annette, a sophisticated woman who had never known the horrors of his youth, asked him bewildered what on earth he was doing, Gene did not look at her.
He stared at the doll's black eyes and whispered, "Robert is finally home. He should be comfortable." Annette was not a woman inclined toward the supernatural. She had been raised in a deeply practical, logical family of architects in Ohio. She had married Gene with her eyes wide open to his artistic eccentricities and reclusive moods. She had absolutely not, however, agreed to share her pristine home with whatever demonic presence Robert was. The first severe incident Annette thoroughly documented in her private journals occurred midway through the second week after the doll had been brought downstairs. She descended the stairs into the elegant parlor in the early morning light to prepare tea. She stopped in her tracks, dropping her cup to shatter on the floor. Every single piece of heavy furniture in the room had been moved. This was not a casual nudging by a clumsy maid. The entire room had been systematically, aggressively dismantled and relocated, as though an invisible crew had emptied the space entirely and rebuilt it according to a dizzying alien logic that defied human comfort. The heavy oil paintings had been meticulously rehung at jarring grotesque angles tilted just enough to induce severe vertigo in anyone looking at them without appearing obviously vandalized. In the exact dead center of the chaos sat the doll. It was still in its rocking chair. The rocking chair had not moved an inch. Furious and unsettled, Annette confronted Gene in the studio. He listened to her screaming with that careful, practiced blunt she had come to associate with any conversation touching on Robert. It was a complete psychological withdrawal, a sudden dropping of steel shutters behind his eyes. He calmly stated he did not know how 300 pounds of furniture had levitated across the room. He swore he had not heard a single sound in the night. Then, after a stifling pause that lasted long enough to drain the oxygen from the room, he said terrifyingly softly, "Do not rearrange it, Annette. Leave it the way he likes it." Furious, she spent 3 hours wrestling the heavy furniture back into place. By the following morning, the room had been completely destroyed and reorganized again. This devastating psychological warfare continued unyielding for 11 consecutive days. On the 12th day, Annette surrendered. She stopped fighting the entity and simply learned to navigate the bizarre obstacle course led to the parlor. The horrifying fact that a logical woman stopped fighting for her own sanity after just 11 days tells you everything you need to know about the crushing spiritual weight of living in that. Children who unfortunately visited the house during these dark decades, the innocent offspring of nervous neighbors and rare friends who possessed no foreknowledge of Robert's blood-chilling history, described their encounters with a terrifying consistency that outright refuses logical dismissal. They universally swore, often in tears, that the doll's jet black eyes were actively tracking them. This was not the vague typical unease a child feels when confronted with a creepy antique. This was highly specific. It was the absolute conviction that the doll was not merely passively existing, but observing, calculating, and making malicious judgments about multiple children, separated by years and entirely unacquainted with one another, reported a detail that made parents blood cold.
They claimed the doll's painted expression actually physically changed during their visit. It would wear its standard fixed neutral stare when they timidly entered the parlor. But at some unobserved moment, without anyone physically touching it, without a cloud passing over the sun to change the light, the hardened bisque face would subtly shift. It became, in the exact trembling words of one 7-year-old girl whose psychological evaluation was permanently recorded in 1963, more interested. Like he suddenly decided he really liked me, and I did not want him to like me, because his liking felt like teeth. By 1972, Eugene Otto could no longer bear the weight of the endless sleepless nights and the feeling of constantly being hunted in her own home. She requested, then tearfully demanded, and finally simply enacted an ultimatum.
Robert must return to the turret. She dragged the doll up the narrow stairs herself, locking the heavy door behind her. Robert went back into the dark. The rocking chair went with him.
Eugene Otto died on the cold afternoon of the 23rd of November 1974. The death certificate read cardiac arrest, but Annette knew his heart had simply given up fighting the gravity of the thing upstairs. Annette did not stay in the massive house after the funeral. She could not. She stayed for 3 agonizing nights, locking herself in the downstairs guest bedroom with a chair wedged beneath the doorknob, listening to the heavy, relentless pounding on the floorboards directly above her. On the morning of the 4th day, she rapidly packed 2 small suitcases, hailed a cab, left the keys on the counter, and never stepped foot in Key West again. She sold the sprawling estate the following year at a massive financial loss to anyone willing to buy it. The brave new owners, eager to renovate, discovered the doll sitting patiently in the turret room. They also discovered, wedged deep beneath the rotting floorboard in that same room, the frantic warning letter Gene had written 3 weeks before his heart gave out. The new owners did not last long. Within a rapidly deteriorating period, estimated by local historians at between 6 horrifying months and 2 terrifying years, the residents fled, and the doll was quietly, almost covertly, transferred to the Fort East Martello Museum in Key West. The transfer was entirely unannounced. There was no press release. The doll simply materialized one morning into the museum's obscure backroom collection, anonymously donated by terrified parties who legally demanded their identities remain permanently sealed. The museum's intake card was blissfully ignorant, describing the object only as Robert, a homemade folk art doll circa 1900, Key West provenance. The meager placard made absolutely no mention of the Otto family's torment, the locked turret room, the desperate letter predicting death, or the staggering 70 years of a prominent man's life entirely consumed in the inescapable, crushing gravitational field of an entity he had been cursed with when he was only 4 years old. The museum curators, unbothered by rumors, placed Robert in a reinforced glass display case in a dedicated, climate-controlled room within the old brick fort. In an ironic twist of fate, they provided him with a new wooden chair. It is the infamous letter wall that elevates Robert's case from a local ghost story into a globally confirmed, terrifying phenomenon. This wall distinguishes his glass case from every other allegedly haunted object residing in any paranormal museum anywhere on Earth. The letters began flooding the museum's mailroom within mere months of Robert going on public display. Today, the curators estimate the raw count of these letters strictly exceeds many thousand, continuously arriving every single week. They arrive from all 50 states of the United States. They come from the highlands of Scotland, the dense cities of Japan, the outback of Australia. They are furiously scrawled in English, Spanish, terrified German, and frantic French. They use elegant, embossed hotel stationery, ripped, bloody notebook paper, expensive cream-colored parchment, and the hastily scribbled backs of tourist postcards. All of them, without a single solitary exception, are desperate letters of apology. The pattern these chaotic letters follow is so incredibly terrifying, so perfectly mathematically consistent across thousands of different writers from vastly different global backgrounds, that the psychological pattern itself has become the subject of intense academic study. The cycle is brutally simple. The writer visited the humid Key West Museum while on vacation. The writer approached the glass case and saw Robert. The writer boldly did something disrespectful. They snapped a flash photograph without verbally asking the doll's permission. They laughed loudly at the crude stitching. They made a smug, sarcastic comment to their spouse, or they disrespectfully tapped their fingers against the thick glass barrier. The writer then left the museum, chuckling, and flew back to their mundane, ordinary life. And then, the universe began to violently, aggressively dismantle them. The letters document a torrential downpour of unexplainable suffering, catastrophic, sudden mechanical failures in perfectly maintained vehicles, horrific, life-altering medical emergencies striking out of nowhere, devastating financial ruin overnight, the sudden violent implosion of marriages and long-term relationships that had previously been unshakable, illness, despair, and tragedy arriving without warning, tracking the victims across oceans. A particularly harrowing letter from a prominent executive living in Munich, Germany, dated the 14th of September 2003, captures the essence of this terror. The trembling handwriting reads, "I did not believe the plaque.
My husband and I both laughed directly in his face. It was a joke to us. On the long flight home across the Atlantic, my strong, healthy husband bizarrely broke 3 of his fingers when the lightweight overhead compartment slammed down on his hand in a physically impossible manner, an injury the veteran flight attendants swore they had never witnessed. The precise moment the plane touched down, my phone flooded with messages. My elderly mother had fallen down the stairs and shattered her hip. When we finally arrived at our secure modern home, a massive torrent of black water was cascading through our ceiling from an interior pipe that plumbers later swore had been perfectly intact. I am an atheist. I am an engineer. I am not a superstitious person. I am writing this pathetic letter on my knees because I have completely run out of scientific explanations. My family is falling apart, and I would like, please, I beg you, for the punishment to stop. Robert, I am so sorry. Due to this undeniable catastrophic wave of misfortune, the museum management implemented a strict, terrifying rule. They now formally instruct visitors to speak aloud to the doll before raising a camera. You must stand before the glass, look into the black voids of his eyes and cleanly state, "Robert, respectfully, may I take your photograph?" You must then wait. You are instructed to watch the doll's face, specifically the tilt of its head and the glass eyes. If you feel any internal response that your instinct interprets as a negative, you are firmly warned not to press the shutter. Most modern tourists find this highly amusing. Most visitors take the photograph regardless, blinded by arrogance, and most visitors find themselves utterly ruined, frantically penning letters to a doll in Florida months later.
The core question at the bleeding center of this century-old case is not the amateur's query of whether Robert is haunted. A ghost is a remnant of a human soul. The infinitely more terrifying question is attempting to understand what kind of thing Robert actually is. These are not identical inquiries. The first question invites a comforting binary yes or no answer, which is relaxing because it neatly closes the investigation down. The second question demands that you sit alone in the pitch black with the agonizing discomfort of an entity that aggressively, violently refuses every logical, religious, or scientific framework humanity tries to force upon it. To even begin to comprehend the terrifying mechanics of what Robert might be, you must travel backward and understand the ancient dark traditions from which he almost certainly was birthed. The wronged Bahamian servant who gave the doll to young Jean has been definitively erased from the whitewashed ledgers of Key West history. She exists in the documentation only as an ominous shadow, a distinctly shaped void defined entirely by the terror radiating from what she left behind. But the weapon she built carries the unmistakable bloody signature of a highly specific, potent esoteric practice known as obeah. Obeah is not Hollywood magic. It originated strictly among the enslaved populations of West Africa, violently transported to the cruel plantations of the Caribbean throughout 3 centuries of the brutal Atlantic slave trade. It remains intensely practiced today in deeply hidden corners across Jamaica, Trinidad, Barbados, and the dense archipelagos of the Bahamas. It is deeply misunderstood by outsiders and colonial historians who merely label it a primitive system of hexes and curses. Obeah is in reality a terrifyingly complete spiritual cosmology. It is an intricate mathematical framework for manipulating the razor-thin membrane between the fleshy world of the living and the ravenous world of the dead. It encompasses mystical healing and supernatural protection just as effortlessly and brutally as it encompasses total annihilation. One of the most profound, dangerous mechanisms inside the obeah tradition is the complex creation of what high clerics and practitioners call a spirit vessel. A spirit vessel is an inanimate object, painstakingly prepared over weeks through highly specific blood-tied ritualistic processes designed to serve as a permanent physical anchor and dwelling place for a volatile spiritual entity from the other side. The unseen entity and the physical vessel exist in a terrifying state of mutual parasitism. The physical vessel provides the wandering entity with a concrete, stable anchor point, a way to exert physical force in the material world. In return, the entity infects the vessel with a sinister, animating consciousness, the exact quality that makes certain antique objects feel, to those who nervously walk past them, fundamentally and terribly alive. And a doll, from a dark practitioner's practical standpoint, is an exceptionally perfectly designed spirit vessel. It inherently possesses a humanoid form without actually being human. This plunges it repeatedly into the deepest, darkest trenches of the human nervous system's defense mechanisms. It sits square in the category of things the amygdala responds to with visceral, prehistoric unease. It is close enough to our shape to forcefully engage our brain's facial recognition software, yet far enough from warmth and flesh to cause those systems to crash in panic. It has eyes, the primary evolutionary channel through which primates assess the deadly intentions of other predators. It features a fixed, painted expression that our continuous face-reading instinct desperately attempts to interpret, continuously failing to resolve whether the object wishes to hug us or dissect us. It is exactly the kind of seemingly innocent Trojan horse object that an enraged, powerless servant, unjustly thrown into poverty by a wealthy, untouchable family, might hand to a trusting child on her way out the door, not to harm the child directly. This is the crucial, chilling nuance that amateur ghost hunters, cheap documentaries, and dramatic retellings consistently miss or deliberately obscure, simply because direct demon child violence makes for a cheaper, easily digested campfire story. The Bahamian woman did not hate little Jean. She gave Robert to Eugene Otto as a nuclear strike directed at the foundation of the household that had stolen her livelihood. The wealthy, insulated parents were untouchable, but their love for their child was their vulnerability. The young, impressionable boy was merely the open door through which she invited the parasitic vessel to enter the house. He was the innocent conduit through which the entity established its permanent anchor point. Through his childlike love and boundless imagination, the curse became a permanent resident, burning down the psychological sanctuary of the home where the injustice had occurred. Jean inadvertently became Robert's battery. He became Robert's person. And to be selected as Robert's person meant the death of freedom. It meant never ever being entirely alone, even in a locked bathroom. Every romantic relationship Jean desperately tried to form as an adult existed under the crushing, suffocating observation of Robert's presence. Every canvas he painted was scrutinized by glass eyes. He could banish the physical doll to the dusty turret room, but he could never ever banish the suffocating entity attached to it. The heavy iron anchor was deeply set. The rusted chain forged between boy and monster when he was barely 4 years old had not weakened a fraction of an inch in the 7 agonizing decades that followed. This tragic realization is exactly what the frantic letter hidden beneath the floorboard actually reveals, when you read it not as the ramblings of a madman, but as the final testament of a man who suddenly fully understood the horrific physics of his own den. I made a terrible mistake when I was 4 years old. He did not make the mistake of accepting the gift. He was 4. He possessed no defensive vocabulary, no psychic shields to reject a Trojan horse. The catastrophic mistake he made was the exact same mistake any innocent, imaginative child makes when handed something extraordinary, lonely, and slightly strange. He loved it. He hugged it. He offered it a name, giving it identity. He eagerly let it name him in return, giving it authority. He pulled up the heavy chair for it at the family dinner table. He offered it a commanding view from the window of the highest room. He sacrificed 70 years of his solitary, anxious, paint-smudged life feeding it his vital energy. Without realizing the spiritual contract he was signing, he enthusiastically every single day for 70 years, and by the time the old man's heart began to fail and he truly understood the monstrous scale of what he had done, the doorway had been propped open much too long. It could never be closed again. There is a highly specific deeply unnatural quality to the ambient light inside the 40s Martello Museum during the late fading hours of a November afternoon. The dying sun in Key West in late autumn sits terribly low and pale on the horizon. It is violently stripped of the aggressive, vibrant, tropical confidence it wields in the high summer. Instead, it seems to crawl through the museum's incredibly thick brick-walled rooms at a creeping angle that is almost horizontal. The light feels remarkably apologetic, hesitant, as though it possesses enough primitive awareness to know it is not entirely welcome in spaces this damp, this old, and this devastatingly heavy with accumulated angry presence. In that anemic, fading light in the dead center of the quietest block of the fort, Robert sits. He waits inside his fortified glass case, perched upon his small wooden chair, suffocating in his century-old cloth sailor suit. His terrifyingly black glass eyes aim squarely at whatever poor soul happens to wander in front of his line of sight. His painted expression remains what it has always been for over 100 years. The not-quite smile, the not-quite frown. It is the unreadable expression of an apex predator waiting in the high grass, an entity armed with the infinite, terrible patience of something that acutely understands time works entirely differently for its immortal structure than it does for the fragile bags of rotting meat and breaking bones that constantly come and go around it. Among the literal tens of thousands of digital and film photographs terrified visitors have captured of Robert in his case, there exists a tightly guarded, highly classified subset that senior museum staff whisper about off the clock. They refer to this hidden folder internally as the anomalous set. These are the horrifying photographs in which Robert's expression appears fundamentally, physically different from the hard, fixed, neutral expression he is documented to wear in reality. It is not a cartoonishly dramatic, Hollywood-style demonic snarl. If it were, it could be easily debunked as digital manipulation. The horror lies in the terrible subtlety. It is the kind of microscopic anatomical difference you only notice after staring at the photo for 5 long minutes, after your brain's deep facial recognition software has had adequate time to process the nightmare it is attempting to decipher. It is a slight millimeter elevation of the painted corners of the mouth, a heavy lowering of the stiff brow bone that creates an impossible, menacing shadow across his upper face. Above all else, it is a localized, terrifying quality developing within the black glass eyes. This is the detail most researchers find impossible to articulate without sounding insane, because it involves attributing biological malice to 2 cheap manufactured buttons. It is a quality of deeply directed intelligence. It is the soul-crushing realization of something inside the void, using the ambient light of the museum room to actively look back through the camera lens directly at the photographer. These anomalous photographs have been exhaustively examined by skeptical forensic photography experts, digital image analysts, and lighting technicians. Their professional consensus is uniform and deeply chilling. The photographs possess no signs of Photoshop. They are unaltered. The film emulsion and digital sensors accurately recorded exactly whatever physical alteration was occurring in front of the lens at the precise fraction of a second the shutter clicked open. Whatever that impossibility was, it remains unresolved. A former highly ranked museum curator, visibly exhausted and heavily medicated, spoke to an author in 2009 under the strictest conditions of anonymity. They described the psychological toll of reviewing the anomalous folder. I went home to my apartment that evening, poured a drink, and sat perfectly still in my kitchen for over 3 hours before I found the courage to turn on any of the lamps. I still think about certain photographs from that cursed folder at incredibly odd, inconvenient moments, never when I am actively trying to remember them. But when I am doing something completely mundane, washing my hair with my eyes closed or walking down a dark hallway, suddenly One of those impossible smiling faces is just vividly there. It is fully rendered and present in my mind, and I literally have to stand still and wait for the entity to recede before I can physically force my legs to continue walking. When the author pressed the curator on exactly what specific detail triggered this paralyzing effect, the former employee went dead silent for a full minute, trembling. Then they whispered into the tape recorder, because in the really bad photos he doesn't just look like a creepy doll, he looks like he recognizes you, and he looks like he hates you. The massive Victorian house on Eaton Street still proudly stands to this day. Unbelievably, it has been aggressively renovated, brightly painted, and publicly opened as a charming upscale bed and breakfast. Every year, eager tourists pay exorbitant amounts of money to sleep blissfully in the very bedrooms where Eugene Otto slowly lost his mind over 70 years of psychological torture. The dreaded turret room, the epicenter of the madness, is available for nightly booking. Due to its dark fame, it commands the highest premium rate on the property. The guests who foolishly pay to sleep in the turret report their experiences to the weary management, experiences the staff have been strictly trained to neither confirm with agreement nor deny with mockery. Guests routinely describe the heavy, suffocating sensation of being intently observed from the corners of the room. They report anomalous, localized drops in temperature. They hear small, terrifyingly specific auditory hallucinations. The sound of a heavy body shifting its weight on ancient floorboards, and the unmistakable, rapid scuttling of something tiny and hard sprinting across the wood. They describe bolting awake at 3 in the morning, hearts slamming against their ribs, overwhelmed with the absolute primal conviction that there is something standing very, very still in the pitch-black corner nearest the window, watching the bed, observing them with the patient, unhurried attention of a parasite that distinctly understands the current occupants of the mattress will eventually pack their bags and leave, and the entity will still be reigning in the darkness long after their names are forgotten. If you compile every police report, every frantic diary entry, thousands of apology letters, and every testimony collected across more than a bloody century of unbroken documentation, the most common unifying phrase that spontaneously appears from victims from all walks of life is a haunting variant of the exact same formulation. They never write, "It felt slightly eerie." They don't say, "It felt conventionally strange or spooky." They all write the teachings, "It felt exactly like it knew I was there." Asterisk, that horrifying knowing is the psychological breaking point that rational people continuously reach for. It is the specific, maddening quality of being deeply intellectually known and mapped by something that physics dictates should not be capable of complex thought. It is the terrifying violation of being recognized and judged by a chaotic jumble of rusty wire, rotting cloth, dry straw, and dark glass, by whatever demonic gravity the Bahamian woman stuffed down into the doll's chest on a humid, moonless night that no written record officially describes, and no living witness survived to warn us about. This is the central radioactive truth about ancient spirit vessels that the old oral traditions deeply respect, and the modern arrogant world consistently fatally fails to comprehend. They are not inanimate tapes playing a recorded loop. They are not static. They are hungry, and they grow. These entities are actively fed by human attention in the exact same mathematical way a raging grease fire is fed by a sudden rush of fresh oxygen. They are not specifically fed by your belief in the paranormal. That is a myth. That is the genius of the trap. Arrogant, mocking disbelief generates the exact same high-voltage emotional attention as terrified belief does. Every single skeptical tourist who has ever scoffed loudly and laughed in Robert's face through the thick museum glass has dropped a battery into his system. Every panicked victim who has frantically scribbled a tear-stained letter of profound apology to an address in Florida has fed him a feast. Every late-night documentary broadcast to millions of glowing screens. Every viral internet article generating millions of clicks. Every deep-dive archival file exploring the history of the doll. Everything feeds the vessel.
I am acutely aware of the terrifying implication of what we are doing right now. By creating this document, by broadcasting this frequency, we have fed him. By listening to this, you are feeding him right now. The very last known letter to ever officially enter the museum's glass display collection was received in the rainy spring of 2009. It was written on plain, cheap white printer paper in a very small, meticulously neat handwriting, the specific, careful handwriting of someone who had been taught penmanship rigorously as a child and had obsessively maintained the habit into old age. It was completely unsigned. The return address was provided. It was faintly postmarked from a sprawling, tech-heavy city
in the Pacific Northwest of the United States, a city known globally for its relentless cold rain, its oppressive gray light, and a very particular heavy quality of urban melancholy that sits suspended in the damp air like a fog that never quite manages to evaporate. The letter, neat and terrifying, read in its entirety, "I am writing this to confess that I have never visited your museum. I have never in my entire life booked a flight to Key West, Florida. I have never stood in that room and I have never seen you in person. 3 weeks ago I clicked on a random article online and I read the history about you, and then, to my horror, I could not stop thinking about you, an intrusive thought that burrowed into my skull. And then, a few days later, I started to physically feel, at very specific, quiet moments, particularly when I am alone at night and the house settles, that you were somehow suddenly aware of my thoughts, that the simple act of reading your name on a glowing screen thousands of miles away had been severely enough to forge a connection, that my passive, accidental attention itself had been enough to open a door in my hallway. I am a rational human being. I do not logically know if such quantum spiritual entanglement is even theoretically possible, but I am writing this pathetic, desperate letter tonight because I have completely run out of other rational things to try. The shadows in my bedroom are changing shapes, and I have not slept in 72 hours. I am so deeply sorry for whatever cosmic law I have accidentally broken by simply knowing the details of your existence. I would like, more than anything in the world, to please be able to stop thinking about you. I would like, please, for the crushing feeling of being watched from the dark corner of my ceiling to stop. I do not know how to successfully format this plea or ask for this mercy more specifically. I am sorry. I am very, very sorry. Please, I am begging you to let me go. The museum staff silently added it to the overflowing collection wall. The writer was never heard from again. 1,000 miles away, Robert still sits inside his reinforced glass case. The Florida sun fades into pitch blackness. The facility securely locks down for the night, but inside the dark his jet black eyes never close. Though he's still facing the door, he is still waiting for whoever walks in next. He is waiting for you. The archives are officially closed for tonight. Lock your doors, check the corners of your room, and sleep well.